I think in some very strong sense, all of us, or anybody watching this video, is in a sense predestined to be a philosopher. That I think
Right.
there's part of being a philosopher that's just very much part of human nature. And I always think of this with my undergraduates every year, especially people coming in to do intro with me for the first time in a university experience, that very, very few, if any of them, will go on to academia. But I think all of them will have philosophy as some part of their lives, just in the sense that every um, everyone who has the capacity to engage in argument and reflection. So anybody who's in a university class or even in a high school class is going to have moments when they ask themselves sort of foundational questions. What am I doing here? What's the point of this? What do I really value? And those are all philosophical questions. Like, I think philosophy is something very, very natural to us as a species. What's a little unnatural to us is the pursuit of academic philosophy as such, is, reading David Lewis or Iris Murdoch or Plato. That's something that is culturally transmitted and acquired. There's a lot of different philosophical cultures out there, but I think part of the excitement of teaching introductory philosophy is just showing people the interaction that's possible between your sort of natural, spontaneous, first-person philosophical fumblings. Like, you wonder, am I free? Do I really have a choice here? What's the interaction between those kinds of late night grapplings and reading the work of people who've reflected a great deal on these issues and really mapped out a bunch of different options in logical space? And I think education in philosophy is a way of, strengthening your own natural philosophical voice and giving you new tools to grapple with questions that you're just stuck grappling with, like, in your capacity as a human being. Yeah. So that's why I find it so exciting to teach philosophy, is that I get a sort of firsthand sense of how people's own philosophical voices get developed in the classroom.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you actually after this, why is it that philosophy is so important to everyone, especially people who perhaps become a doctor or pursue traditional career paths? But you kind of already answered the question. So I wanted to jump more into, your works and your interests, because I had the good fortune to read Knowledge, a Very Short Introduction, and that was,
all right. Yeah. So the question, what is knowledge, is really hard one, essentially because knowledge is such a foundational concept, right? It's not something that you can just break down into 12 easier pieces. In fact, it's foundational in a way that really resists analysis, very, very interestingly. Knowledge is in some way like a really desirable state of mind. Like, would you rather just think that something's true or know that it's true? It's hard, well, of course, it depends on the truth, right? But if it's something, well, now I'm gonna immediately back myself into a corner that I won't be able to get out of. I feel like I need to have some kind of bracelet that I can look at, which reminds me that, if someone starts challenging you to give a definition of knowledge, like, don't do it, don't go there, because I think it's a very interesting, it's a concept that's very interestingly resistant to analysis. Which doesn't mean it's resistant to understanding. And I feel like everyone's just gonna hit pause on this video right now and switch to something that's a little bit more fun. But if you've stayed with us, try to walk you through this. The contrast that you just sketched there between knowing that something's true and thinking that it's true is a distinction that's not just an English language distinction, although we draw it in English, and we draw it very heavily, like those verbs to know, to think, are among the most frequent in our language, and their counterparts are very frequent in other languages as well. So basically all the languages of the world mark that kind of distinction, and truth has a great deal to do with what's going on in that distinction. So if I say that the teacher knew that Sally had plagiarized her paper, and I say the teacher thought that Billy had plagiarized his paper, if I say those two things, So the teacher knew that Sally had plagiarized her paper. I can't say that unless I'm already committed to the idea that Sally plagiarized the paper, right? It seems like saying that the teacher knew that this was true. I'm indicating that, with that verb to know, that I'm committed to this complement clause that follows it. So knowing is some kind of state of mind that can only attach to truths. Thinking that something's the case can attach both to truths and to falsehoods, right? So you can think that something's true and you're right, or you can think that something's true and you're wrong. Could go either way. So it's a less restricted state, and it's less informative in general to tell somebody that someone thinks that something's true than to tell them that someone knows that something's true. We actually use the verb, I think, a lot in speech to each other in a way that might or might not be confusing. So the phrase, I think, comes up in unplanned English. It's the most common epistemic phrase, and it comes up in unplanned discourse, like when people are just chatting and they haven't like written out a speech or something like that, about once every 3 minutes. And you usually throw in, I think, when you want to sort of hedge or trigger the need for more fuzziness or for more vagueness. Yeah, I think it was on Wednesday, blah, blah, blah. That's different from just saying it was on Wednesday, right? So you want to actually send a signal to the other person that, yeah, this might or might not be right. That's usually the signal that we're sending when we actually use that, I think, when we throw it in on something. And people who work in experimental pragmatics and linguistics think that one of the reasons why saying I think has that force of decreasing speaker commitment or triggering the need for more fuzziness or vagueness is usually when we say things to each other, we're presenting ourselves as knowing that something's the case. That is, I'm presenting myself as if whatever I'm saying is true, and that I'm somehow locked onto the truth, that you can follow my words as a guide to the truth. And that's usually how we interact with each other as conversational partners. That's the standing default assumption, that we can guide each other to the truth. So that's a default assumption. Now I can exploit the fact that this is a default assumption, and I can deliberately say things that are false to try and manipulate or deceive you. But manipulation or deception wouldn't ever be successful if it weren't for the fact that there is this standing background presumption that we can use each other as guides to the truth. And a person who knows is a safe guide to the truth. The person who just thinks or believes that something's the case and doesn't know, yeah, maybe, maybe not, right? So that distinction between being able to trust and not being able to trust the person that you're talking to is a really, really foundational distinction we draw in the course of all real-time communicative exchanges with each other. Interestingly, like artificial intelligence is sometimes pretty weak on this. So I don't know if you've been following, GPT-3 and these new AI developments where you can produce neural networks that will chat away and create really nicely, syntactically, even semantically composed streams of text, but they're not as like obsessed with the truth and anchored onto the truth as we are. So it really makes me think like there's something very foundational about human beings that, believe it or not, even in this day and age, we care about the truth. And we care about whether or not other people are or are not locked onto the truth. And that's like the fundamental distinction that gets drawn in epistemology. Is a distinction between being locked onto the truth and being not necessarily locked onto the truth. And that's really what we're trying to get, what we're trying to look at. Right. Now, a lot of people have. Okay, sorry. I should let you ask a question. No zero in on what
I'm just listening to what you're saying, and also just building off of that too.
Okay.
What degree of certainty do we need to believe in a fact to consider it knowledge? Like, is it 99.9%? Is it 85%? As you mentioned in your book, I thought it was interesting how one of the examples was, even if we've bought a lotto ticket and we know there's a 99.9% chance that we haven't won the lotto, we still don't really want to say we have not won the lottery for a fact, because there's still that 0.01% chance. So what is the limit that we draw?
I actually think it's 100. So, I
100.
actually think, I think as soon as you start thinking, yeah, but there's a chance that maybe that door is unlocked, as soon as you go there, you actually kick yourself out of the state of knowing,
Right.
unfortunately. But I think sometimes the weird thing is that asking yourself, wait a second, am I really sure of this? Checking on the state of knowledge is something that itself can either destroy the state or temporarily destroy your access to it. It's sort of like, this is something I think sometimes, so I don't know if you've ever been on your way to the airport and you start thinking, yeah, but do I have my passport in my handbag? And suppose that the only way that you could know this was to like reach into the bag and pull your passport out of your bag. It's a bit like that. As soon as you like dig in to check, then it's not in your bag anymore, right? And so I think it's possible to ask yourself questions about the possession of knowledge that will actually end up destroying that possession. It's not necessarily the case. Like I do think there are times when you can ask yourself a question like, do I actually know that the Pythagorean theorem is correct? Is that something that I know, or is that something that I've just like kind of memorized and I don't really know it? You can actually walk through the proof and reconvince yourself that this is something that actually you do know.
Right.
So there certainly are circumstances in which reflection on the higher order question, not just does the square of the hypotenuse equal the squares of the other two sides, but asking, is that geometrical formula, something that I know to be true? That higher order question, sometimes you can answer it safely, but yeah, not always.
And building off of that, actually, so what do you think, you mentioned the role of testimonials in knowledge. Given that we're in an age where almost all of our information comes from things like Wikipedia, like other individuals, reading books, etc., to what extent can we place an emphasis on that form of collecting knowledge? How much should we trust the testimonial? And in what cases, in what instances should we not trust those testimonials and only believe what we see for ourselves?
Yeah, okay, so that's a really interesting question, a very big question.
Mm,
I think it's cool that you're contrasting testimony or secondhand knowledge with what we see for ourselves. And I think there's sometimes a temptation to think that testimony always has to be second class. And
mm,
what we see for ourselves, well, you know what, that's going to be definitive. But actually, I think there's cases in which you should have more faith in what other people are telling you than in the testimony of your own senses, right? Like, you can have, for example, hallucinated something. And you're asking everybody, did everybody see that like weird red flash? And everybody around you is like, no, what? That could definitely be a case in which actually testimony is your more reliable guide. So I don't think there's an automatic assumption that firsthand is better than secondhand. Secondhand can be stronger, depending on what those second hands are and what they're doing. And this brings me to the other part of your question, which is a question about trust. I think it's very complicated. I think it's very difficult. We have some naturally evolved mechanisms for epistemic trust. Unfortunately, those emerged under evolutionary pressure in small scale societies over hundreds of thousands of years. And we're now in a very, very different informational climate where our original instincts might not be so reliable, and we might need to supplement those instincts with a bunch of other techniques. So, I mean, generally speaking, like just do very, very rough, very quick approximation, you decide whether or not to trust what someone's saying, that is to take their word for something, on the basis of whether they seem to you to be competent and benevolent. Those are the two things. I have to, I have to know what seem to know what I'm talking about. And I also have to seem to have your best interests at heart. Because of course, if I'm ultra competent, super smart, but I'm also
right.
a pathological manipulator, you should not trust me. If I'm incredibly benevolent, sweetheart, also complete idiot, you should not trust me. You want that sweet spot of competence and benevolence.
Mm,
But those things are of course, also, easy to fake and not enough and so on. I think the sort of supplementary mechanisms we need are kind of a little bit old fashioned, right? Like people need to be well educated. I think a strong scientific education is very important. So, if somebody's pushing some kind of argument that hinges on anecdotal evidence, it's good to be aware of what kinds of statistical reasoning actually would be cogent in that case. So I think strong scientific education is very good. It's protective. But I think also, it's a little bit of an arms race between us and our new informational climate, that there's so many interesting motivations and interesting structures behind the current dissemination of information, including we spend a lot of our time on platforms which have algorithms which are just there to maximize engagement. It doesn't matter whether what you're fooling around with on Twitter is true or false. It doesn't actually even matter whether you agree or disagree with it. What matters is whether it's sticky and whether you get caught up in it. And so, some of these fly traps that are out there might be pulling you down the road towards some really shady, radical, problematic, self-destructive or other destructive ways of thinking, but you'll just get stuck in them because the platform is designed to be addictive. And I do think, looking at it from that perspective, you can't just sort of say to everybody, okay, everybody, like, pull up your socks and like be aware that not everything on social media is right. We might have to do more to actually regulate social media, from kind of a epistemic public health perspective, right? So if people are spending, I think the average now, I read this in Statista, is people are spending about 144 minutes a day, global average of internet users. That's how long people spend every day on social media. And if a lot of that is just swimming in falsehood, this is actually really, that's way worse than, cigarette smoking or cocaine use, I think. Now, I don't think, the internet is necessarily entirely the enemy. You mentioned Wikipedia, and I think Wikipedia functions on the whole terrifically well. So there's different parts of Wikipedia, and entries in different classes have different kinds of epistemic credentials, but in a lot of areas, Wikipedia is just an amazing resource. And so it's really interesting to sort of study the mechanisms that have been put in place to protect Wikipedia from abuse. Like, what is it that enables editors to revert vandalism to pages and to, I think on the whole, human beings are benevolent, and on the whole, we don't have strong interests in deceiving and manipulating each other. So I think one thing that's really valuable is for people to do sort of applied epistemology, where they're studying the protective mechanisms of information ecosystems that are working well and contrasting those to the mechanisms that are at work in ecosystems that are working badly, and to think of actually about how you could do more to control, legislate, promote these things, just as we control, legislate, and promote the release of dioxin into the atmosphere.
In the book, you mentioned many theories of knowledge that seem to rely on also the process of forming that belief. So, for example, the justified true belief theory. And you bring up this interesting example of someone who looks at a broken clock, and it happens to be just the exact current time. And you asked, does it actually count as knowledge and knowing the time, or is it just a lucky guess? So what would you, I kind of wanted to ask you, what are some of the pros and cons of the justified true belief theory of knowledge? And could you maybe give a brief overview of that, perhaps for our listeners who might not know what that is?
Okay, so I said at the beginning that knowledge is something that's very intimately tied up with truth, that knowing is a state of mind you can have only to truths. But that doesn't mean that every state of mind you have with respect to truths is therefore a state of knowledge, right? No, truth is a necessary but not sufficient condition to count as knowing that something's the case. And there are a lot of examples of this sort of going back. So the stock example in classical Indian philosophy was there's some kind of game where you had to guess how many shells someone has hidden in their fist, right? And you have some overconfident gambler who says, you're holding 5 shells. And the person opens their hand, 5 shells right there. Did the gambler know? Yeah, probably not, right? Like, you can, you have a lucky guess there. And so just getting it right is not sufficient for knowing. You have to have something else. From Plato, and also in the classical Indian tradition, it's been recognized that this other thing that you have, let's call it justification, does seem to be important. Plato's example is the person who knows which of these 2 paths leads to Larissa, right? And Plato points out, like, even the idiot who just has no idea could get it right. The frequent traveler, the person who's always going to Larissa every weekend, is actually, you think he's going to know. And when we look at a case like that, we think, well, why is it that the frequent traveler knows? Well, maybe because he could tell you about that path. He could give you a justification for his choice. He could say, oh yeah, actually the reason why I'm telling you that this path is because notice it goes off to the east and Larissa, he can give you some kind of story. The case you mentioned with the broken clock is something that Bertrand Russell talks about in the mid-20th century, where he's just trying to draw the difference between true belief and knowledge. He says, yeah, you could happen to look at a clock that's coincidentally stopped at the correct time. Looks like you don't actually know what time it is. Now, why don't you know? Well, maybe because if you sat there for a while and after an hour you realized, oh crap, the clock's hands haven't moved, you'd say, I have no idea what time it is, right? You wouldn't say, oh, so since it was 1:17 when I sat down, now it's 2:17, right? You didn't get locked onto the truth or anchored onto the truth by your encounter with that clock. It's an interesting example because typically, if you just glance at the clock as you're walking past and someone asks you to know what time it is, you're going to say, yeah, it's 3 o'clock. You won't say, wait a second, I'm not sure whether the clock I just looked at is or is not working or something like that. And you said, well, that's a lucky guess. It's not quite a lucky guess, though. That's what the way Russell seemed to think of it at the time. But the person who wonders what time it is, glances at the clock and says, it's 1:17. That person's not being lucky. They're actually being perfectly reasonable, right? So they've got some justification. If someone asks, why do you think it's 1:17? They'll be like, because I just looked at the clock. Like, isn't that how you usually tell what time it is? Right? The person has some justification. They're being reasonable. Somehow that justification doesn't seem like it's enough for knowing, right? What they can say to explain their position or support it, the kind of little argument that they could give, doesn't look strong enough. Now, this is the crazy thing. And in Eastern philosophy, this starts coming out around the 6th century. In Western philosophy, it starts coming out around 1963 with a paper by a guy called Edmund Gettier. There's a question, what do you have to add to justification in the sense of, yeah, there's a story I can tell. It's a totally reasonable story about how I came up with my answer, and true belief in order to get knowledge. And that seems like a question that turns out to be really, really hard to answer. But I think I have such a strong feeling that it's really, really like it turns out to be very hard to answer, actually, for reasons that I think Plato was already aware of. So in Plato's Theaetetus, they ask a version of that question, like, what beyond true judgment do you have to have for knowledge? And they go through a whole series of candidate proposals, and none of them seems quite adequate. All of these suggestions seem to sort of misclassify cases. And I think a big part of why why these various answers seem to be inadequate is that you can very easily come up with cases where, yeah, intuitively this person does seem to know, although their counterpart, to whom things seem very similar, doesn't seem to know. And so there's a real puzzle here. There's a really strong, enduring puzzle. And I think part of the problem is a lot of these conceptions of justification are being understood just from that first person perspective. Like, you stop and ask the guy, hey, how come you thought it was 1:17 p.m.? And he's like introspecting for a minute. And it's like, because I looked at the clock, right? And if you could go move up to a God's eye perspective or an external perspective and look down on the whole scene, there's the broken clock, here's the guy, you would say there's something about that relationship from that God's eye perspective that doesn't seem right for knowledge. That clock hasn't moved in 5 days. So whoever walks by it and looks at it is not gaining knowledge of what time it is right now. Even if they occasionally, like twice every 24 hours, might gain a true belief, they're not gaining knowledge because it's not securing them or linking them or locking them onto the truth in a way that a clock that's perfectly reflecting the current time would be locking them onto the truth. But there's just that disparity from that first person perspective and the third person perspective where you're looking down. Even though in cases where somebody walks past a clock which is functioning perfectly normally, we would want to say, yeah, that person knows what time it is. From the first person perspective, in the instant, in the moment, those two cases won't be discriminable from each other. And one of the lessons you might get from this is that whether you are or are not in a state of knowledge is not something that can be perfectly discriminated in all cases from the first person perspective. That might be one of the really important lessons that you're getting, that knowing is not something that you can necessarily verify for yourself. It might be like, you know, you've got this passport in your handbag, and from a God's eye perspective, someone can tell that it's there. If you start going to try to verify it for yourself, you might pull your passport out of your bag and suddenly it's not true anymore that your passport is in your bag. But the fact that you couldn't verify it didn't mean that it wasn't there in the first place. So there's kind of, one of the lessons you're getting here is there's limits to self-checking. I think that's like the ultimate lesson of getting your cases.
Right. Okay. And building off of also that, I kind of like this phrase building off of, but the first person perspective justification for knowledge. What is the role of intuitions in knowledge as well? Because we've already established that knowledge is very connected to trust of other individuals. But I suppose sometimes we, not just in the realm of knowledge, but also things like the yuck factor, like we have a yuck factor when we're exposed to things like incest or necrophilia. Is that intuition, to what extent is intuition a valuable tool in philosophy, especially considering things like thought experiments? And is that sufficient to make a philosophical case for something, or do we need more of a not so much reactive justification for it?
Oh, how interesting. So when I contrast intuitive and reflective cognition, I think the key thing is whether you are or are not aware of a sequence of steps in your reasoning, right? So you can go back to the kinds of examples that John Locke gives. So he says intuitive cognition is the kind of cognition you have when you see that a circle's not a square, right? There's no like series of steps that you have to go through to sort of calculate that difference. I just present it to you and have immediate reaction. Reflective cognition is the kind of cognition that you go through when you demonstrate that I don't know, that the square root of 2 is irrational or something, or when you do long division and you have a series of explicit inferential steps that you're walking through. Although Locke said, interestingly, you know, one of the things is each of those steps taken individually is itself intuitive, right? So it's intuitive for us because it's an automatic overlearned response that, I don't know, 2 + 3 = 5, right? You don't have to, you know, kids might have to do the 1, 2, 3, 4. So could be a stage in development where it's more reflective, but for us, like single digit addition is intuitive. Long division is going to be reflective most of the time. So you have to go through a series of digit by digit calculations. But you'll notice that we don't have a choice. We don't say, so should we be intuitive or should we be reflective? Even when you're being reflective, you are ultimately having a lot of intuitions guiding your cognition, right? And I think what's going on in intuitive cognition is you have a lot of a vast amount of your intelligence, a vast amount of your cognitive power is operative below the level of consciousness. You're given a prompt or a query or a question, you know, what's 7 times 11? The answer will come to mind for you automatically, involuntarily, even if you try not to let it do so, right? And so we kind of can't help but rely on a lot of that capacity within ourselves, right? And then we can actively control to some extent, the course of our reflective cognition, right? So if I ask you this is a stock example, I can ask you what 7 divided by 11 is, or something like that. You're going to start going through a series of stages. Or not, you could just say, you know what, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to do that. I'm going to do mental math. Get away. So it's a little different. You have a little bit of choice, a little bit of control. Right. One of the things that we find, though, is that these automatic answers, which just come bubbling up from below, while they constitute a huge part of our cognitive capacity, and we don't in fact have the option of just saying, oh, you know what, I don't trust intuition. We necessarily have to rely on it very, very heavily to navigate around the world and to solve all kinds of intellectual problems. We discover we can't trust it blindly, because we have patterns of intuition that don't add up, right? And one of the clearest places where we find this is in philosophical paradoxes. So, you have certain intuitions about like objects continuing over time, or in fact intuitions about knowledge, which don't add up. It can't all be right. And I think also in the sort of political and social arena, right? Like you have a bunch of intuitions, for example, about how women should behave, right? And you try to write them all down, and you realize, oh damn, there's like a double bind here, right? There's things that I'm supposed to do and the same things I'm not supposed to do, and there is absolutely no way of satisfying all these dictates. And that tells you there's something wrong with the dictates. Fortunately, we're in a position where we are reflective animals, and we have the capacity to go in there and start figuring out, okay, which intuitions are wrong? So, if somebody has a feeling of revulsion at the idea of homosexuality, for example, is that avenue into the truth, or is that product of a certain kind of enculturation? And it's actually, ultimately, if you sort of reflect through the larger package of intuitions and you think about, you get to know more about homosexuality and about morality and so on, you might come to think that gut feeling is actually, it's a mistake. It's something that needs to be corrected. And we have this in epistemology as well, right? So I think there's actually some packages of epistemological intuitions that's very easy to trigger, but they're mistaken. There's something wrong with them. And we have to learn a little bit more about where these intuitions are coming from to be able to discriminate which ones are mistaken, which ones are confused. And just as in perception, right? Like I can show you perceptual illusions. And so these two lines, this thing looks like it's moving, but it's not, because it's like ink on a page, right? But your perceptual system has certain heuristics and shortcuts built into it that will create the impression of motion. So sort of the more you learn about your own system, the more you can be, if you like, an intelligent and discriminate consumer of intuitions. These intuitions just come bubbling up. You don't have to follow them slavishly. You can discipline them and decide, no, those are mistaken. These are sharper. These are things that I can coherently bring together into an intellectually satisfying theory of what's going on here.
Yeah, and I guess it also depends on the attitude you go in with as well. So with optical illusions, the very first sort of the first few seconds where you see it, you kind of fall into that trap of seeing what most people see, right? But then when you go through with maybe a more reflective look at the illusion itself and what comprises the illusion, then you start to realize, am I actually seeing dots in between these black squares? So does that mean that in philosophy, and when we're forming arguments and justifications for things, we shouldn't necessarily rely on our first intuitions, but rather peruse them a bit more and then trust our second intuitions? And what if there are paradoxes between what we intuitively believe at first as a gut reaction versus what we later on reflect to be as a more refined second intuition of a situation? So do you think that we should always strive to challenge our intuitions and maybe reflect on them to create the second, more refined intuition of what we actually believe?
Oh, I think that's a really good question. There might not be a general answer to it, and I think I might want some kind of I might want there not to be a general answer to it. I might want there to
Right.
be some kind of population diversity in this, right? That there are going to be some people who are going to like agonize and resist all their intuitions all the way. And there are some people who are going to go with the first thing they think. And I say this because I think there are some cases in which getting extra reflective can pull you away from the truth. Right. I think Jean-Jacques Rousseau is very, very worried about this. He thought that, the ethical heroes are the women of the marketplace who just like step in there. And
Right.
when a couple guys are in a fist fight, they try and pull them away from each other to stop them from hurting each other. And, meanwhile, the super, super educated scholar is up there in his study, like constructing an elaborate defense of colonialism or something like that. Yeah, so I don't think there's this sort of general answer that, yeah, we should always my own inclination is to I guess to think twice, but not always necessarily with like I mean, and keep an open mind and be open to the idea that you can have reversals. And I've certainly experienced this in my own thinking, where I start out sort of thinking something and then I rethink it and I decide that I was wrong, and then years later, I realized, actually, no, the first thought I had on that was right. So you can really come around after
Right.
after a while. I do think it's possible to learn a lot from conversation with others whose intuitions might be different from yours, and
Right.
so that's something that's valuable as well.
Segueing from that into more philosophy of mind questions, given that your intuitions change a lot, who you are might also change a lot over time. What is the self? Like, what makes someone who they are and defines their identity? Is there like a continuous identity that we have, or are we just a collection of thoughts, reactions to things, intuitions?
I'm actually open to skepticism about the self. So I'm not convinced that the self, as it intuitively appears to us, is something real. I think that actually might be a mistake.
Cool.
So that's actually something that I'm open to. But I think I do not have a quick answer to your question.
Right.
I think there is some version of what you might call the self, which is real. It's just not maybe what it seems to be. It's something deeper, weirder, and more complicated, right? So you might have a sense of an ultimately very simple, enduring actor that unifies your existence through time. And it might be that that's a little bit of a fabrication, that's a little bit of a fiction, that what is actually your reality is something a little bit more confusing than that. But you'll notice I'm using the expression your reality, right? Like we use all these person marking features all the time in speech. I'll use first person pronoun for me, I'll use second person pronoun for you, and third person, as if we're referring to sort of a single lasting entity, that you could speak of the self the way that you could speak of, this glass. And I think sort of the metaphysical category into which the self falls might be something more composed and more interesting and more metaphysically weird than this glass. So like we destroy all sentient life on Earth through, let's say, a virus that kills us all like really bad, really fast. And there's no, and all the animals too, not just humans. So there's no consciousness left around to appreciate this glass, but this thing might actually continue with its being in a way that's pretty similar to what it is now. I think with selves, if there was like this super virus which kills all sentient beings, actually except for this one right here, maybe let's say Jennifer Nagel has some kind of immunity to it, I actually think myself would not continue in the way that this glass would. That the self is actually ultimately socially composed in a really weird way. Yeah, but it's so strange that you're asking me about this, because like I don't really work on the self, but I do think it's a really, really interesting question,
Right.
and it's really hard. I'll recommend some books on this. So Thomas
Yeah.
Metzinger's book Being No One, I think,
Okay.
is a fascinating and somewhat terrifying read. I'm actually not entirely in his camp, but I think there's something very interesting about what he's getting into. I do think these sort of uses of person markers are very, very fundamental in human language and cognition. And the role that person marking pronouns are playing, and sort of reference to selves, or to selves, maybe we put it in scare quotes, absolutely cognitively foundational and fundamental for us. Also super, super weird metaphysically, and really worth thinking about pretty critically.
Right. Yeah, there's a specific example. I don't know if it came from your book or another book that I read, but it was the example of Odysseus' ship, where basically he was throwing the wooden planks and then recreating a new ship out of those wooden planks. And to what extent is that the same ship, right? If you're throwing one wooden plank off and then replacing it with a new one, now you have two original versions of that ship. So that kind of
Right.
boggled me.
And I would say, like, my first inclinations are kind of, physicalist, and I wanted to say it's not the case that the self is this like weird, immaterial, spooky soul substance or something like that. But then if I want to say, okay, so I'm going to identify with my physical brain, as soon as you go there, you start thinking, yeah, but of course, cells are renewing over time, and the physical composition of your brain
Right.
is changing. Yeah, you start getting into some pretty strange trains of thought there.
Right. What are your thoughts on like consciousness? So because when we think of consciousness, it's difficult because we can either think of it as a physical state, so something tied directly to the brain, or more of a mental state, that the mind and the brain and the body are separate from each other. And especially with the rise of AI and this whole question of whether we can program consciousness into robots, it's become a lot more pertinent in our society. So maybe what is a simple, I hate saying what is a simple overview of these questions, because they're just massive questions, but what are your thoughts on on how to define consciousness, and whether is it tied to the physical components of our body, or is it more of a like, do you support dualist accounts?
I'm absolutely not a dualist, no.
No. Okay.
But no, but I think the nature of consciousness is something uh, is is something very, very interesting and difficult. I'm really interested in the computational role of consciousness in cognition more broadly. That consciousness seems to be some kind of weird bottleneck in our information processing. Only a very, very restricted flow of information is conscious for us. And
Mm,
it's certainly not reflective of our entire cognitive capacity. So for me, a very, very interesting question is, what's the function of having the spotlight shining where it does? There's a theory of consciousness that when I first heard it struck me as absolutely ridiculous, which is Christopher Frith's idea that consciousness is for sharing, that ultimately the function of consciousness is a social function. And one of the really interesting features of consciousness, which a lot of people are willing to grant, is that conscious contents are those that are reportable to others. And Frith says that that's not an accident, not a coincidence. It's something about um, our social coordination and social needs that has produced the phenomenon of consciousness under evolutionary pressure. And if you really want to understand the nature of consciousness, you should take a really, really hard look at what is going on in communication between members of our species. And as I say, when I first heard this, it struck me as obviously ridiculous, right? That consciousness is the one thing you can understand if you're like alone in the universe and 8 other people around and so on. But actually, I'm kind of warming up to that way of thinking about consciousness a little bit now. That actually, I think it's very, very interesting to look at the communicative functions performed by consciousness as a way of understanding why consciousness has the nature that it does. That said, I'm very far from understanding what consciousness is.
Right. What is an example of the communicative function of consciousness?
So you can do all kinds of like super smart things without being conscious of what you're doing, right? So when you're riding a bicycle, you are like balancing yourself and like tensing some muscles and relaxing others in ways that you could not begin to articulate to another person. But then when you're trying to think of, okay, well, what are the kinds of things that are conscious for me, right? When you are aware that something is the case, like you're aware that there is milk in the fridge right now or something like that, you don't just have that proposition, there is milk in the fridge right now, coming up for you on some kind of inner clipboard of truths that you could check off. It doesn't quite work like that. When you're aware of that truth, you're not just aware of it, but you're also aware of something about how it is that you're aware of it. So it's different for you to be aware of that truth because you're actually looking at the milk right now, or because you are remembering that you bought milk this morning and just put it in the fridge, or because you just asked your brother, hey, do we have milk right now? And you hear him opening the fridge and he says, yeah, we got some. And then you can go ahead and like plan your recipe or something like that. Those are different conditions. It feels different to judge that there's milk in the fridge on the basis of these different types of conditions. And when you, there's something about your knowledge of the proposition, there's now milk in the fridge, that's like colored differently depending on what your source of information is. Why do we have that? Why do we have that? It might be because keeping track of those differences is something which is really vital when we are communicating with other people. So if I'm standing next to you and I've got to share information with you, I need to have some way of telling what you do and don't already know about the situation. If I'm standing right next to you, I've got to communicate with you. I'm not going to say, oh, there is a table in front of us right now. Like that would be weird if we're both standing there looking at the table, right? I've got to tell you what you don't already know, right? So I've got to have some angle on what is my relationship with these truths in ways that might differentiate it from your relationship with these truths, which is why, everybody has those kinds of internal, if you like, markers of how it is that we're related to the world. It's actually something that's supporting our communicative interactions with each other. I don't know if this is making any sense. I feel like I could sort of like go on about this for a very, very, very long time. But there's something here that's actually really deeply connected with whatever it is that sets human beings apart from all of the other species. So there's lots of other animals that signal each other. Bees do it, white-tailed deer do it. There's lots of other animals that are cooperative with each other, like beavers will build dams together and so on. We are the only animal species that is actively epistemically cooperative. That is, we collaborate and work together. We inform each other, we communicate in ways that make it a collaborative shared project to build a picture of the world. So we're always informing each other. Like you mentioned that, huge amount of what we know is secondhand. Yeah, you're not kidding, right? Like so much of what you know about reality is picked up from other people. No other animal species does this. No other animal species actually engages in questioning each other, or in checking, have I been understood or not, or in sending repair signals, right? So in ordinary conversation, a lot of the time, someone says something and you're like, what, huh? No other animal does that, even though they must have sometimes failed communications with each other. We're the only species where we're sort of actively checking in on each other. And we've got this kind of like shared project of figuring out like, hey, what's going on with reality here? And it could be that actually consciousness is playing a huge role in that shared project of figuring out what's going on with reality. And an animal which just kind of lives in its own horizon, in its own little like raccoon world, and it's focused on feeding and mating or whatever, like it doesn't need to be conscious because it doesn't need to get into this, hey, do you see this the way I do? or what can I tell you that you don't already know? It's not evolved to do that. We are, and this is something that has ended up producing this incredible thing of having not just as huge information flow in from the world, but this weird kind of like meta thing where we also know something about how the information is flowing. That's the really cool thing. That's what consciousness is.
Right. Wow. I'm just processing all that.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you this before when we were discussing knowledge because it was more relevant. But I suppose it's also relevant to the question of consciousness, because supposedly if consciousness was just a bunch of neurons firing up in our minds, we could just be a brain in a vat. We could just be programmed in a computer simulation, or we could import that consciousness to robots. But do you think we are in a simulation? And if so, or if not, why? I'm fascinated by this question, so I was just curious to see what your views on this were.
So it's interesting that you are asking me that. What do you think?
What do I think?
Yeah.
So my intuition says no, of course.
Yeah.
Even the most basic questions that you mentioned in your book, like, am I currently wearing? Oh, I'm not actually currently wearing socks or shoes, but
yeah. That's the great thing about Zoom, right? Barefoot. I am too.
Do I currently have hair?
Yeah.
Basic question like that. Obviously, intuitively, I would say yes. But I do. I find Nick Bostrom's simulation theory. I did a cursory reading of that, and I found it pretty persuasive. So I would say, rationally, logically, if I take a step apart from my own egocentric intuitions, I would say the probability that we're in a simulation is quite large.
That's interesting. I mean, I think whether it's a good argument or not kind of depends on what your premises are, what your starting points are.
That's true.
And maybe there could be some starting points that you could challenge there. I do think it's interesting if someone asks you, "Are we in a simulation?" Like, I'm always tempted to double down, and it's like, yeah, you nailed it. You found it out. Busted. Damn. Game over. But no, I think it's interesting where you start, that like intuitively it feels like we're not. And then you are a smart enough philosopher to be aware that the very next move that the evil genius makes is to say, yes, of course, wahaha, I have designed it so that intuitively it'll feel like you're not. That's the whole trick here.
There you go.
All right. So you're going to really quickly realize that you're not going to come up with arguments that will persuade the skeptic that we're not in a simulation, where these arguments, to be a good sport, start only from premises that the skeptic is bound to accept. And there's very good reasons for that, because if the skeptic is a smart skeptic, smartest skeptic of all is not the academic skeptic who steps out on the stage and says, I can demonstrate that human knowledge is impossible, right? Because that guy, like, oh yeah, let's see that demonstration. And do you know it's true, right? Like he's going to walk into his own trap in a heartbeat. The smartest skeptic is just Pyrrhonian skeptic, who just keeps questioning. He just keeps saying, oh, are you sure? And why do you think that? And, and the Pyrrhonian skeptic only inquires. The Pyrrhonian skeptic never settles. The Pyrrhonian skeptic for the Pyrrhonian skeptic, skepticism is a practice. It's an activity. It's like yoga. It's not a doctrine. Like, I'm not going to teach you. I'm just, as a Pyrrhonian skeptic, I'm going to be really enhanced in all these skeptical techniques of like weighing one thing against another and so on. And there's a lot of, there's the Pyrrhonian skeptic, there's different versions of this. I think Sriharsa, the classical Indian skeptic, is also super amazing. He also just gives you a whole series of techniques. And he starts his book, The Delights of Refutation, or The Sweets of Refutation, with sort of exhortation to the reader, oh, men of wisdom, like, may you attain to the delight of universal conquest in argument, merely by repeating parrot-like these arguments of mine, or something like that. It's like, you're gonna get such a kick out of this. You will win every debating tournament from here on out. Here's how you do it. And he gives you this whole series of like skeptical arguments you can use. And he ends by saying, yeah, you know what, and you'll notice I've maybe made some mistakes in the course of this book, and actually that was deliberate. It was just to keep you guys on your toes. And and also, if you're ever like in a really sticky jam and you can't remember which of the skeptical arguments you're supposed to use in this particular situation, here's a tip that always works, which is just listen to your adversary very closely, pick out some word that he's saying, and ask, now what exactly do you mean by that? Right? And it's like, oh, this is actually really, really great advice for getting by in philosophy, right, if you're ever stuck. But yeah, you can just always keep questioning, right? And so you got to realize immediately, if I'm with a skeptic, he doesn't have a doctrine, he just has this strategy to always keep questioning. The only way you can outflank the skeptic is to ask him questions. But also you can notice in a kind of higher order way that this whole practice of us asking each other questions is a practice that makes sense if we're oriented towards something. Like assuming we're not just engaged in Zoom for the sake of Zoom or language practice or something like that. Usually questioning is something that's directed towards knowledge, towards truth. Like we're trying to find the answer, right? We're not just like, I'll ask you a question and then I'll just say the first random thing that comes into my head, right? The whole idea of questioning is we're looking for something, right? And maybe it's a presupposition of that whole activity that there is something within our grasp. So you can get into some kind of like higher order reflections, and you can also get into higher order reflections on why is it that skeptical arguments feel so compelling? So maybe they feel really compelling because if you actually do know something, but someone starts challenging you and say, hey, do you know that? Do you know there's a table in front of you? That's a move which generally, when people challenge you on whether or not you know something, generally that's a move that people make when there's some good reason to think that you don't know something, right? Because generally we are an epistemically cooperative species, right? As a species, we've got this sort of shared project of figuring out like, hey, what's going on around us? Like, yeah. And so if people start challenging you, that's actually often itself some kind of evidence, minor evidence that you don't know what you think you know. So it's actually good for us in general to be attuned to that signal of, yeah, crap, maybe I don't know this stuff. But it's something that can be blown out of control with skeptical line of questioning. So I don't think you ever get out of you don't get ever out of skepticism by constructing a persuasive argument from premises that skeptic is bound to accept there's no such argument. One of the things that might help, though, is to try to anchor your intellectual activity, like in the actual world in which you find yourself, right? And recognize that if this is a genuine intellectual exchange, I am Jennifer, you are Elizabeth, we are having a conversation. Readers out there or watchers out there are looking at something. If this is a genuine exchange, you know, there is some reality here that we are exploring together. You might want to go the sort of Dave Chalmers route and say, so maybe this reality isn't ultimately made of particles. Maybe this reality in which we're having this conversation is ultimately made of electronic signals. Still, we can have knowledge of it. We can discover truths about it, structures about it, patterns within it. That makes sense and are meaningful. So that's a sort of that's some sort of prize, and we can still maybe even kind of like demonstratively indicate things. We can talk about this glass right here, what its ultimate nature is. You know, that might be a subject of further conversation, but I wouldn't be too quick to assume that it's not possible for us to have knowledge of it.
That's interesting. But then also in terms of how we use language, you know, semantically. When I'm referring to you as Jennifer, you wouldn't be Jennifer as in the living Jennifer, but rather a bunch of electronic signals that were fed into my brain in the vat. So is knowledge also intimately connected with how we use language as well? And I guess.
Sure, and I guess if,
Yeah.
actually, if you are in a simulation, just to play with that for a minute, then what do you mean when you say the living Jennifer versus a bunch of electronic signals, right? The only living Jennifer you've ever encountered, the only living frog you've ever encountered, the only living anything you've ever encountered is, you know, a bunch of signals. And so in a weird sense, what you mean by living is just that.
That's true. That is true.
So maybe that's a contrast you can't quite draw.
See, that was my primary intuition kicking in and then making that judgment. But then, as you pointed that out, my secondary intuition realized, hey, that doesn't make
Yeah,
sense.
like I was feeling like that answer is a little bit facile, because I think I think actually your primary intuition might be right about that, that there is a kind of contrast that you're pointing to that I'm not doing justice to. But look, I will say this, just the fact that you can't argue yourself out of something doesn't mean that you are actually trapped there. It might be that there are certain natural starting points that you're given by your environment, that are given to you and not given to you as the result of an argument. They're given to you in another way. So there are certain starting points that we have, like just you and me as different individuals. We have it as a fact here. That there is some kind of meeting of two minds, and this isn't something that we had to prove from first principles or establish. It's just condition in which we found ourselves in. Can we prove that we're in this condition? Maybe not, but that doesn't mean that we're not in it.
Right.
Maybe like one of the things we're discovering is something about the limits of proof, something about the limits of what can be established with argumentation. And maybe one of the takeaway messages I want to offer your audience is not everything has to be established by argumentation. Some things might be brute facts. Thank goodness. Thank goodness not everything has to be established by argumentation.
When you say brute facts, that kind of opens up a whole door of a whole world of questions. But do you just mean like intuitively, based on our senses, we know that we are here speaking with each other? Like, what do you mean by a brute fact?
Well, so the way I was thinking of it just then,
Right.
I was thinking that truths are not defined, the truths themselves are not defined by our means of access to them. So
I see.
just as I think, reality continues to exist even if sentient life gets wiped out. So, reality isn't what's necessarily knowable or provable or what we experience.
Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, for agreeing to do this and taking.
Thanks, Elizabeth. This was fun.